continued to reverberate, that has continued to reverberate in society. Okay. And then we recognize that the other principle of critical race theory really is recognizing that racism and racial inequality is a normal feature and is embedded within systems and institutions. So what do we mean by that? And I'll show you examples a little bit later on. What do we mean? And oftentimes people, and this is where a lot of the controversy too has come into place. What do you mean we have racist systems? What do you mean that we are, for us, I think for us as human beings sometimes, it gives us solace if we think the world is fair, especially when we've done well too. And so for us to think, and there is this, and for me immigrating to the US, I've noticed this certain level of what we call American exceptionalism, right? So we often want to recognize the good of America and talk about the good of America, but we never want to talk about the bad of America. Right. So even throughout history, when history really should be history is just the truth of the good and bad of what has happened. History often does not tell the good and bad stories. History can often be one-sided. So basically, what critical race theory says, hey, let's look at how racial inequality has continuously been embedded in institutions and systems throughout the United States. Okay, so let me give you one example. How many of you have heard of redlining? The concept of redlining. So the concept of redlining basically was the Federal Housing Authority when they came into place. And this happened a lot in Chicago. This explains why Chicago is laid out the way it is. What they did was they looked at, they would have a map of a city or a place, and they would look at the neighborhoods throughout that city or place, and they would be like, okay, neighborhoods where predominantly people of European descent lived would get a color green. Neighborhoods where primarily Black people lived would get the color red, and so on. And so with redlining, then based on the neighborhood you lived in, would determine whether or not you would qualify for a loan to purchase a house, whether you'd be eligible to purchase a house. So this continued for decades, right? And so this was embedded in the law. It was perfectly legal. If you look up the concept of redlining, you'll learn a lot about it, where people, Ta-Nehisi Coates, he talks about, he has a clip on The Atlantic called The Case for Reparations. You can actually listen to it or read it, where he interviews an old farmer who came up from Mississippi to Lawndale here in Chicago. And he wanted to purchase a house for him and his family. But because this neighborhood, which had been changing and predominantly Jewish, and as the Great Migration happened and African Americans started to move into certain neighborhoods, then a lot of people started to move out of those neighborhoods. And he was ineligible because of the neighborhood and so on. He was ineligible for a federal loan. So what ended up happening was then people would take advantage of the fact that there were a lot of African Americans who couldn't qualify for loans. What they would do, they would purchase the home. So I think, I can't remember the details, but I want to say this guy's house was maybe $12,000. So a guy purchased it for $12,000, and then he would basically do like a rent to own program to this man, where this man would pay 2 or 3 times what the house actually costs. And it was basically predatory. What we have is predatory lending. And as he would pay, if he missed one payment, he would completely lose everything he's paid before and completely lose the house. And this continued for generations. This continued a lot. When we had the big crash in 2008, 2009, that was just, it was kind of another version where there was a lot, what they discovered was there was a lot of predatory lending going on. And the predatory lending primarily happened a lot against a lot of Black and Brown people who, based on the system, weren't able to traditionally qualify for the low interest rate loans. And so they ended up being taken advantage of and getting a lot of loans with very high interest rates and loans that couldn't be sustained. So critical race theory is basically states, okay, let's look at all of these pieces. And that's not just say, okay, well, why don't more Black people own their homes, or why don't more people have accumulated wealth? What we've discovered is that the greatest wealth disparity in the US is home ownership. And it's like, well, why is it home ownership? And when you go back to these kinds of laws and systems, you begin to see why. You begin to see, okay, well, it isn't just, and that's a good question to always ask. Well, why is this? Why is it that home ownership is a struggle? And you go and you see the why behind it, right? So basically, critical race theory just says, okay, there's no such thing as colorblind. So we used to want to say, oh, I'm just colorblind. I see everybody is the same. And, we like to say like the America's a melting pot. And I never like to use that analogy. I often like to use the analogy of being more of a salad, right? So a melting pot, everything kind of blends in. Sometimes you can't taste the difference, taste the same. But when you have a salad, you enjoy to see the beautiful colors. You see your lettuce, you see your tomatoes, your cucumbers, your carrots, and you can taste them. They come together, but you can taste them. And so I prefer that analogy, like, no, we're not colorblind. And no, because if you're colorblind, you're going to tell me I'm a biracial Black Caribbean woman, and you're telling me you don't see me for who I am, and I believe I was created exactly the way I am. So no, we're not colorblind. No, it's not just meritocracy. So it's just not you work hard. Yes, you work hard, but you also work hard and the opportunities. And then as we're having conversations, even about policing and systems and so on, we keep hearing about a few bad apples, a few bad apples. And eventually, if a farmer keeps getting a few bad apples, he's gonna start being like, okay, so what's wrong here with going on? Do we have to treat, are we having issues with the trees, with the roots? What's really going on? I can't sustain these few bad apples without getting to the root of the issue, right? But so far we have chosen to just dismiss a lot. We would prefer to just dismiss it, to be like, oh, it's just a few bad apples. No, it really isn't. It really is the system. It really is things that throughout history that has accumulated that have put us in this place. So I know a lot of you are educators, and the whole concern, and I got a lot of questions about critical race theory and education and so on. And I really like this quote by Karaya Bridges out of, you can see my PowerPoint, right? Okay. Out of the University of Berkeley. And she says, no kindergartner that I know is familiar with the Constitution. In fact, no 12th grader I know has a baseline of knowledge to engage with critical race theory. So critical race theory is not being taught in K through 12 schools, she said. So the concern that, oh, this is being taught in schools, no, it actually isn't, right? So we see here Ruby Bridges, the first day, Brown versus Board of Education, when school was being integrated, and when we think about, oh, is this being taught in school? And parents are like, all up in arms. Well, what are they teaching my child? What are they being indoctrinated? Well, the reality is it really isn't being taught in school. It really hasn't been taught in school. And how I know this is I can simply pick up a textbook belonging to my kids, and I can see that none of these concepts are being taught. And one of the things, because I'm from Barbados and I went to school there, I said, okay, well, let me do a comparison. Okay, so growing up in the Caribbean, and we took history, and I compared our high school history curriculum to kind of the high school history curriculum here in the United States. And if you take a look, you can see the difference. And you can tell me if you see any overlap, what do you notice as we look at the American history curriculum versus the Caribbean history curriculum? Has anybody noticed anything they want to share?
Well, I don't see a lot of overlap
Yeah.
at all, but I don't know. These are the topics of the curriculum, but I don't know what's being taught within those topics either. But the Caribbean one does seem to be more specific.
So yes, so we in the Caribbean, when we do history, so we went from the very beginning. Okay, so one of the first things I remember learning is about the Carib and Arawaks. It is chronological because history should be taught in a chronological way. And so, but our chronology started from the very beginning, before we were colonized. Okay, so we go back to talking about the Arawaks, the Caribs, the Taino people. We go back to learning about all of those, right? And then we come through the centuries, and that's how we learned history. And I remember I know one of the questions about at what age, at age 13 or 14, Amistad came out, and we were taken as a school to go see the movie Amistad, which really documents, which is about a slave ship coming over, and going through the transatlantic slave trade and throughout. And so we never shied away in the Caribbean. We learn through. I learned the relationship of the United States, and this is just through fifth form. When I get a little bit further, I even studied a little bit more of American history, but I was able to learn. I did European history too. I did American history, and then I learned more specifically about Caribbean history and all of those components. What I have noticed in the United States, and these are all the times throughout, but it appears to me, the United States, that the curriculum one doesn't go from a global perspective, right? So I've noticed that it really just hones in on the US itself. So it doesn't give a world history as much. And then even within those history conversations, then you start to wonder what's selected, what's actually talked about. And when you start to get into it, you realize there are very little conversations about certain realities that took place. So you might read, yes, you might read about like slavery happened, but there's no delving into it, right? And one thing, now in the last year, everybody's heard of the Tulsa Massacre riots. But you ask how many people actually were taught about the Tulsa Massacre riots in school. I was just watching a thing where in Oklahoma itself, they were never taught about that. So we have here the Roaring 20s. This was in the 1920s. And Tulsa wasn't the only one. There were multiple cities throughout the US that were burnt, Black cities that were thriving financially, that were burned to the ground, and the land was stolen and things were taken away. But this was not, and they often say history, what is the content of history is determined by the conqueror, by the person who won, right? They tell history from their side. But ultimately, when we look at what's being taught in American schools, it's very seldom that these conversations, there are opportunities for it, but it's not been in the curriculum. It's not been in the textbooks. Okay. I mean, there have been textbooks that have been documented where they talk about the Civil War, but it goes around. I've read where it goes around history. It doesn't talk about when the cruxes for the Civil War was to end slavery. It talks about, conquering the land and all these pieces. There were textbooks that talk about, instead of calling it slavery, call it immigration. And so for some reason, it appears as though it's made us feel better that we want to sanitize our history, and history is just what it is. It's history. I consider myself a Christian or believer, and if I read the Bible, it's like the Bible has good and bad. It has stories about people doing horrific things and murdering people, and then stories about people doing good. Like history is just what it is, and it's okay. What really matters is what we do with that history and how we move forward. But for some reason, we felt the need not to accurately all the time depict history, and I think that's what's happened with our society and what's happening right now, where if you don't have a comprehensive understanding of what has previously taken place, then we kind of fill it in with our own narratives. We fill it in from our worldview, from our perspective. So then we get a lot of questions. Well, why are people struggling like this? Well, why can't they just, we begin to blame people who have been impacted negatively from history because we don't know the history. We just start to blame them. Well, why can't they do better? They've been free. They have the same rights we do. Well, do they really? Well, let's look at history. Let's look at when they're tried and they got their land taken away. Let's look at the fact that examples of it. Let's look at the fact that even now there's a disparity between the sentencing for pure cocaine versus crack cocaine, right? So crack cocaine, if you know, crack cocaine is predominantly used by African Americans. Pure cocaine, you got to be rich to afford pure cocaine. And it was, I think Bush reduced the sentence, the disparity, but it was like 100 times more time you would get for using crack than using pure cocaine. And then we talk about the heroin epidemic, but there was always a heroin epidemic. There was a heroin epidemic in the Black community, but it wasn't seen as a heroin epidemic. It wasn't seen as a public health issue. It was seen as a criminal issue. So will we document this in history? Or will we continue to just kind of glaze over it? So as we start to compare curriculum, it really isn't embedded right now. There's a fight to have it embedded. But even this book, the 1619 Project by Nikole Hannah-Jones, even this has been very controversial, right? Even this, something like this, where she created and tried to have these conversations, has been controversial. And we can't, in my opinion, we can't move forward unless we have these conversations and we take a sober look at our past to figure out where we're going. Okay, I wanted to show you a clip. It didn't embed here. I don't know how many of you have seen it. Oh, it did, yay. The documentary 13th. Hold on. Trying to make it bigger. 1 second. Okay, let's try this again. Make sure you can you hear it when it played? Were you able to hear it? Okay, let's watch it. In the world, I want to hear what we practice what we
We can see the images, Shania, but we can't hear it.
Okay. How many of you have seen that documentary? 13. Yes. So it should be on Netflix. Ava DuVernay talked about that. She wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, and she looks at our criminal justice system, and she looks at it, you could say, through a critical race lens, and she looks at how has the criminal justice system what has it really done, and how has it really treated people of color, especially Black people in this country. And you begin to delve into, well, it's called 13th because the 13th Amendment, which amended, for slaves to be free, except, you could be treated a certain way if you were a criminal. And so that is a documentary worth watching. But what we're saying, ultimately, when we're saying why we don't want to have these conversations, we don't want our kids to learn about any of these things. We don't want our kids to learn, ultimately, Nixon's chief of staff. I don't know if Nixon's chief of staff was quoted saying that he recognized that he started the war on drugs, the concept of the war on drugs, and hippies and Blacks were the main target. Like, if we could criminalize, we couldn't just outright say we don't like these people, but if we could criminalize drugs as much as possible, then we can make these people criminals. And so from then, that was a trajectory of how we've got where we are with the criminal justice system and the drug epidemic we have. So when we talk about critical race theory, there's so many myths out there that aren't true, right? So I gave you this quote, and it doesn't say, okay, all white people are oppressors and admonish all white people are oppressors or portray all Black people as hopelessly oppressed victims. But basically saying, let's take a sober look at who we are. Let's take a sober look at our history, what our ancestors did, and how it has reverberated throughout generations, right? Let's take a look. We think about 9/11. I don't think you can ever teach American history will ever be taught without talking about 9/11. It was one of those pivotal moments in the US. And my kids now, they know we just traveled, right? So all they know is taking off your shoes, taking out your computer, putting your computer in the bin, can't take through any liquids, can't take through any drinks, all of those pieces. That's all they know. That's the only world they know. They're 11 and 6. I knew a world before that. I knew a world where I could take drinks on the plane. I could take liquid on the plane. I knew a world where I didn't have to take off my shoes or anything like that, right? And so for me, in my mind, I know 9/11 changed that world. So should we be teaching our kids about that history of 9/11? This is the same idea that we need to be able to teach comprehensively about the world we live in and how we've gotten to where we are today. But instead, we've made it into this big taboo, and we have made critical race theory into something where it actually isn't. And that's been the difficult part about it. Okay, so I want to go through some of the questions you all sent me before we get to any other questions, right? So the first one is, how are textbooks and other teaching materials chosen? Is there a checklist for bias as well as facts? What do you do if you find objectionable materials? So from my knowledge, it's all in the hands of, well, textbooks for K through 12 is usually in the hands of the state, okay, and the publishers. So the state ultimately decides which textbooks the students will utilize, which makes it a very, very political piece, okay? So our school system is overly politicized. And right now, with the biggest states, Texas, Florida, and California, and publishers also speak in dollar signs, usually Texas, Florida, and California get to decide predominantly which textbooks are utilized for the rest of the country. Because if a book is written and it's not really, they'll take it off the market. If a book is written and it's not really being published and utilized, it'll be taken off the market. And then how do people actually write the books? You know, I get emails from publishers all the time wanting to know if I want to write. And they might solicit like university professors and different things to write the textbooks. And pretty much it. The books aren't fact checked, or they're basic edits, you know, for grammar and so on. But it's basically up to the authors what they want to include in the book, and then it's up to the state and politicians what text they want to use. And so for me, that is problematic in and of itself, because already what is being taught is very, very political within the school system. And it's not necessarily about the best, most accurate books, most comprehensive books, but as we know at a political level, there are things that happen that we don't even understand that probably determine some of the books that are chosen. And so truth is, there are also disparities where somebody in Texas is probably getting a whole different education to somebody here in Illinois, based on the books that are used. So I know, Gail, you said a background, Gail, yes, okay. A friend was taking a history class at Moraine. She read a specific section and said, I now know why people hate a specific group. The section was completely one-sided about the Middle East. Yeah, and that is the thing, right? So it's easy to overlook these things, and sometimes we just take certain things for granted and we're not fully aware of what is happening. And so unless we bring our biases to the forefront and we start to question everything we see, then we kind of take a lot of things for granted. So most times these books aren't checked for biases or objectionable things, unless there's a big uproar. So how you have to write the publisher. That is basically your only way in addressing some of these issues, or unless it gets a big media frenzy, is to write the publisher. I mean, you can also draw it to the attention of the school districts and the schools, but I've started teaching my kids. I bring books from Barbados too, social studies and Caribbean. Like, this was a textbook I used towards the end of high school. Actually, I still have that. Caribbean freedom, emancipation, and so on. This was a book I used, actually written by one of the professors I know. And it talked about economy and society from emancipation to the past, to the present. But I bring social studies books and different kinds of books from the Caribbean because I look at my kids' books, I'm like, okay, they're not learning about the world. That's a problem for me. They're not learning. There's so many things they're not learning about, and I need to supplement their education. And then the other question, people who believe that critical race theory is being taught in schools may be overzealous in their opinions and beliefs. How would you suggest that we respond in a rational, level-headed way to their ideas? Do you think we can really convince them that they have bought into a narrative that is not only misleading but false? I'd like some concrete ideas for conversation starters. You know, one of the things I've heard is like, first ask them to explain to you what critical race theory is, because most people can't. Most people actually cannot explain to you what it is. And then ask them to show you proof that it's being taught in schools. And they probably don't have any proof that it's being taught in schools. And if somebody truly understood what it was, then hopefully there wouldn't be any opposition to it. You know, it's not like, you know, there's no such thing as a culturally inclusive history. It's just history, or culturally competent history. It's just history. Let's tell history. You know, around Thanksgiving every year, I run a moms group here in Beverly, about 6,000 moms, and I'm part of a diversity collaborative. And people are always asking, what resources can I get to tell the true story of Thanksgiving? What really happened in Thanksgiving? And I was just telling Nicole when she was there, I was like, because you always only used to see the pilgrims, there's a turkey, and then the Native Americans next to them, and they're all there happy and having a good time. And then you look back, you're like, no, that's a lie. That's most definitely a lie. And so even the story of the pilgrims is sanitized And so I was reading around Thanksgiving, I read it from this Native American word. They talked about the fact that Thanksgiving is a time of mourning for Native Americans, right? Because of what it symbolized for them. So they're mourning around Thanksgiving. And so even with basically Thanksgiving stories, we could start there. We don't tell the true story of what really happened during those times. Okay. And then, so the other question too about testing and it being included in the curriculum. I mean, it's not you're going to teach a chapter on critical race theory. It's not you necessarily, it means that in subsection, it means that you are going to, when we're talking about Reconstruction, let's talk about what happened in that period with Black Wall Street and so on, as an example. Let's talk about, when we're talking about the 1980s, let's talk about, or the 70s, talk about the war on drugs. Let's talk about some of those policies. Let's have those real conversations. Let's include that too in the history, even though it's ugly. Let's put that in there and let's talk about, let's start the story with the Native Americans and not necessarily with the Pilgrims landing. Let's start history there. Let's talk about that before who really was on this land, who the land really belongs to. Let's start there, you know? And it's sad that I wish I could, you know, can I get my son to opt out of math? No. Can I get him to opt out of English? So how is it that people are allowing their kids can opt out of these things? Like, I could be selective of what my kids learn in school. You know, there are bills right now that are talking about that. Like, maybe you'll have the kids opt out of it. And, you know, when the questions of being appropriate at the college level, no, because it is something I think we would have a different society if we had more historical accuracy in our curriculum. And so there's so many young people now, or sort of people who don't know because there's not that historical accuracy. And we would have a different society if there was a more comprehensive history. And so it has to be embedded throughout. It just has to be looked at with fresh eyes. And it shouldn't be always, let's tell what a great country America is. No, let's tell the truth, the good and bad of our past. Let's do that. Okay. So I think that pretty much concludes what I want to say. But Victor Ray, sociologist, basically said, making laws outline critical race theory confirms the point that racism is embedded in the law. So you're making laws about outlawing critical race theory, which is proving the point that critical race theory says, which is racism is embedded in the law and in the systems. And this is, you're doing what you're trying to outlaw. So then how can we move forward? We have to be able to move forward by having an accurate depiction of history. And we have to be able to move forward by really soberly looking at who we are, where we came from, and where we want to go. Okay. Okay. So any thoughts, questions? Your time now to share.
I'd really like to know if we can come up with, well, how did we come up with the term critical race theory? I see the word race, I get that because it is a social construct and I get that. But why is it called critical? And why is it called theory? And I mean, it does seem that when you say accurate history, that's what we want. So I don't get, what is the theory part about it? History is not theoretical.
So it was coined by law students. So you're dealing with a bunch, is legal. It was coined originally by law students, legal academy, right? So the critical point is just let's critically analyze, let's critically look at the role race played throughout these systems, throughout the legal system, which was their main target at that point in time. Let's look at these laws and see how it's affecting people racially. So that's, I think, where it came about, you know. And I know sometimes out of context, we often like different terms, we question the actual term, but usually it's because it came from that legal stance, people who were budding attorneys.
So when critical race theory is brought up, what we're doing is reflecting on a hot topic of the 70s. And we're saying in the 70s, this was looked at and they were trying to figure out how to have this discussion. And so this is what they called it. Right now, the discussion is back to accurate history is what we need. We're not talking about teaching that moment in time with those 6 law students. We're talking about the bigger picture.
Yeah, we're talking about, let's take a look
Okay.
at the history. Let's take a look at our systems, right? So I'll give you a point in time example. In many states, the Crown Act is now being passed. Well, the Crown Act basically says that an employer cannot discriminate against somebody because of their hair. And because I have locks, what are dreadlocks, traditionally I could be discriminated against because of my hairstyle. Like you could decide, I don't want to hire you. I don't want to work with you because of your hairstyle. And that's another example of how we look at these laws, how we have to keep looking at the laws and systems to show or to dismantle any that contribute to inequity, you know, to inequality. So
I think the United States could take a good lesson from Germany. I was in Berlin about 5 or 6 years ago, and they don't sweep the history of the Nazis under the rug. They tell the story. They don't glorify it. They tell what was bad about it. They have museums all about Nazism. They have historical sites that you can visit, and they tell the story exactly as it happened without, they're making a judgment. This was a terrible thing. And I don't think the Germans think that it's degrading their country to admit that this happened. And I think maybe that's what we need to do. You know, people seem to think, oh, well, we want our children to grow up loving America. Well, you can still love America and realize that we made some big mistakes in the past.
yeah, I mean, we do this kind of dichotomize good or bad. I mean, nobody's all good, nobody's all bad, right? We're a mix of it. And history and basically, I've heard that too, Cheryl, about the Germans, how they really make sure it's embedded in their educational system. You grow up learning about what happened, right, with the Nazis and everything else. They're not ashamed. They make sure it's taught. So, thank you. Any other thoughts, questions?
Well, thank you very much, Shania. I think that we've learned a lot, and glad everything started working with our technology. And I guess if we have any other questions, we can maybe, do we have your email address at all?
I can send it. Yeah, I know Elaine does.
Okay. In case, you know, if we have any other further questions, because I know this topic is going to be a big one coming up with, especially with the Voting Rights Act, you know, and what's going on in the school board election. So it's definitely going to be on our minds for quite a while.
Yes. And you look at the Voting Rights Act, there's another one, right?
Yeah.
You're telling me race doesn't play a place in the Voting Rights Act and what's going on? Yeah.
Mhm.
So
That's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, it's 11:15 and I want to keep you for the rest of the day. Thank you very much, Shania. Appreciate your taking the time. And
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
too. Thank you.
All right,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Take
see
care.
everybody on Tuesday for the book club.
Okey-doke.
Right, that's right.
Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye.
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 Mhm.